All right, welcome everybody. I'm Rosie Kruger and I work here at the Agency of Education on Child Nutrition Programs. And with me is Abby Nelson.
And I am the Ag Ed Coordinator at NOFA Vermont, and we are in partnership, and I am Program Director of Vermont-VT, and the partnership is with Shelburne Farms, and that is a statewide farm-to-school project in Vermont. Rosie and I created this and last week's webinar in an effort to help farmers better understand the school food market, its rules and regulations, and sales opportunities.
During last week's webinar, we focused on understanding the marketing opportunities that exist in school meals programs, and we described some of the regulations that these programs need to follow. If you missed last week's webinar, it will soon be posted on the Vermont-VT website, and we encourage you to watch it. It covers specific types of products that schools might be looking for to meet the new menu requirements under the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. This week we're going to focus more in depth on local purchasing and how school meals programs may be defining the goals of their farm-to-school programs and how you as a local producer can market yourself to meet those needs.
The change in nutritional and procurement guidelines offers some great opportunities for farmers and producers. However, rather than the informal, often non-committal agreements from years before, there are additional rules and systems in place that schools need to adhere to. We hope to clarify briefly what the new procurement guidelines schools need to follow and how to work with them from a farmer's point of view. "60% of Vermont schools are buying local products. And as you can see from this menu from Thatcher Brook Primary School in Waterbury, even in February, local products are being purchased. Notice what falls into their definition of local.
So we have, at the top they've listed some of the local companies that they're sourcing products from. And then if you look down in the menu, you can see some of the items are highlighted specifically.
And so, for instance, Postabilities is making pizza. They're out of Burlington. And Pete's Greens is providing root crops from Craftsberry. They also include Cabot for their dairy products, Vermont Bean Crafters, and Green Mountain Harvest are from Waitsfield, so ultra-local to Waterbury. And then Sunrise the Orchard is in Shoreham, which is on the other side of the state. So local, that word has become a proxy for specific attributes and values. And you may have developed relationships with some school food directors or managers. You and your products represent all the good things they may associate with local products and what local means to them. It could mean safe. It could mean organic. It could mean fair labor practices. It could mean ultra-local. It could be natural or raised sustainably or ecologically. The definition of local, however, is up to each school or district. As you saw from the prior menu, the definition of local appears to be Vermont products, such as Cabot and Pete's Greens, and there's nothing wrong with this. But it is important for you, as a farmer or producer, to know how your products will be marketed and described. It is important to articulate what those qualities are that you hold and specifications for purchasing through the procurement process.
So procurement is very basically the purchasing of goods or services. And any item or service that's purchased by school meals programs for any dollar amount or any volume must follow the federal, state, and sometimes even local procurement regulations when purchasing products or services for their programs. These regulations generally require a school to compare prices for the exact same product or service from at least 3 vendors for smaller purchases, or they have to go through a formal bidding process for larger purchases. And these regulations aren't new. They've been on the books for many years, but we've never enforced them in Vermont, and we've never provided training to school food service managers on how to follow them. So they are news to a lot of folks. But this year, USDA has notified us at Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education that we have to start reviewing the procurement practices of all our school meals programs starting next year. And in preparation for that, we've been providing training to school food service managers this year, and we're going to continue providing this training next year. So as these school food service managers learn what the regulations are for procurement and begin to follow them, you're going to likely notice that they start shopping for your products very differently. So instead of asking you to sell them what you have that's in season, or telling you that they want to buy $300 worth of local produce, they're likely to ask you for your price on a very specific item and then compare that price to other vendors before making the purchase. From your perspective as a producer, this could seem really disheartening at first. You might be thinking that your wonderful, fresh Vermont grown strawberries are now going to be competing with California strawberries that have been bred for shipping rather than flavor. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. If the food service manager is careful to define what it is that he or she likes so much about your strawberries, that they're delivered to the school within 24 hours of harvest, perhaps, or that they are a specific variety, or that you allow second graders to come on a field trip to your strawberry fields, then you will only be competing with the other strawberry growers in your area who can supply the same exact product and services. So this stuff isn't going to seem easy at first, but ultimately we'll end up with school food service managers buying and serving local products because they value specific traits about the products that we've previously just categorized with it's good because it's local, without clearly defining what that means.
Yes, and also I really view this as an opportunity to establish buying relationships that actually are a contract, so that farmers will know what to expect, what products that they are going to grow. And we'll get into that more through the webinar.
So as I mentioned before, federal law really requires that all purchases made out of the nonprofit school food service account, and that's any funds that mix with federal school meals funds, follow federal procurement regulations. Why? And this is because we want to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used in the most efficient way possible to get the best product at the lowest price. And we also want to make sure that taxpayer dollars are spent fairly. So in the simplest terms, a well-run procurement process will ensure fair and open competition, and vendors will know exactly what the school is looking to buy and will have incentive to give the schools their best price on the product. But this does not mean that schools always have to be shooting for the cheapest food possible. It does mean that they need to define and specify the qualities that they're willing to pay more for. So that extra field trip or the strawberries picked within 24 hours of harvest, if they aren't willing to pay more for those qualities, then they won't specify them, and the business would go to the vendor with the lowest price, whether they were in California or from down the road. But if those qualities were worth more to the school, then they would specify them, and the business would go to the vendor that could provide all those services and qualities. So you might hear about two different types of procurement methods. These aren't things that you need to necessarily remember, but just that you might want to know kind of what's going on the other side in the kitchen when the school food service manager is asking you for prices or asking you to bid on products. So there's two types of procurement methods that the schools need to follow. The first is informal. So if the purchase is under the small purchase threshold, which is $15,000 for most schools in Vermont, then the school just has to check prices for the exact same product or services in 3 places and go with the lowest price. The school gets to choose which 3 vendors to check prices at. So if the school has decided that they want to purchase local products for their program, an easy way to do this is just to contact 3 local producers who make the same product and go with the lowest price of the 3. So in the case of our strawberry farm, the school would contact 3 local berry farms and give them their requirements. And since all 3 places that they've checked the price is at are local to them, whatever that definition of local is, then they know that the lowest price product will be local. For these smaller purchases, this is considered enough competition. For larger purchases over $15,000, schools have to go through a formal procurement process, which involves advertising their invitation for bid or request for proposal in the newspaper. In a formal bid process, any vendor can bid. It's not limited to the vendors that the school chooses to call. And it is a more proactive process on your part. So if you see an advertised invitation for bid or request for proposal, then you have to actively supply that information to the school rather than the school asking you and you responding to them. I often get asked about how we define a purchase. So is it just the 40 pounds of apples that the school is buying this week? Or is it the 1,000 pounds of apples that they might buy over the course of the school year? Or is it the food that they buy over the course of all the food that they buy over the course of the school year? And the answer is that it could be any one of those. It's up to the school. Basically, anytime a school is deciding who they're going to do business with, that counts as a purchase. So some schools may decide to check prices every week, and then in that case, their purchase amount would be only for that week's worth of product. But some schools might like to get everything lined up for the whole year, and in that case, their purchase might be all the product that they will buy for the whole year, and it is likely to fall above the small purchase threshold and need a formal procurement process in that case. Schools cannot arbitrarily break up their purchases into smaller pieces to fall under the small purchase threshold, but they can break them up if there is a good reason. So, for example, a school could decide to break their apple purchase apart from the rest of their fruit purchases because they know that there are many local apple vendors who can bid on the apples, but only 1 or 2 produce wholesalers who would bid on both apples and citrus. So in this case, the school would be increasing competition for their apple purchase and hopefully getting a lower price because of the increased competition. So you might see schools checking prices for a bunch of items at once or just a single item, and they might check prices for a single delivery or for a month's worth of deliveries or the whole school year's worth of deliveries, and that's all up to the school.
So we have a question here from Steve Faust of YOLO Snacks, and his question is, will this webinar have relevance to non-farmers such as YOLO Snacks, so processors?
So that kind of depends if you are intending to sell directly to schools. And if you are selling directly to schools, then all of these procurement regulations are still applying to the school. If you're only selling to schools through distributors, then the distributors need to know about this stuff. And it's not, you're not going to be handling this. But anytime you're doing business directly with a school and the school is purchasing directly from you, then they're going to need to follow these regulations. The other thing that you might be interested in is the webinar that we did last week. We talked a lot about what products that schools are looking to purchase, and that would be relevant to both producers and processors who are selling directly to school meals programs and to school meals programs through distributors.
Right, and there's actual mention about the CN labels that are needed, or what was the other label?
CN labels or product formulation statements.
Thank you. So.
All right, looks like we've got a couple other questions, so I'm going to just take a minute so that we can take a look at these. So click on them. Oh, it looks like I'm talking too fast, so I will try to slow down. Thanks for that note.
Okay.
So we've got a question about colleges. Colleges do not follow these same procedures. So this is just for school meals programs that get federal reimbursement for their school meals programs. So generally K-12 school meals programs. Colleges, because they're paying for their food with private funds from student tuition, the federal government doesn't get to tell them what procurement regulations to follow.
Okay, but as a side note, Keith, I work on farm to institution through NOFA Vermont and am working with colleges and hospitals. So please contact me after this webinar and we can have a conversation.
Okay, great. So let's see, let's move on. So when schools are procuring local foods, when a school has decided that they want to purchase from local producers, these are a few of the USDA sanctioned ways that they can increase their odds that the local product will be less expensive and more competitive than the non-local version of the product. So we can see there was that contact 3 local vendors thing that I mentioned earlier. So if it's a smaller purchase, they can choose who they're reaching out to check prices, and they can choose to reach out to only local vendors. If it's a larger purchase, or if they want to increase their odds, or if it's an item that there may not be 3 local vendors for the product, they can do these other things to increase the competitiveness of the local product. Farm of origin labeling, product harvested within 48 or 24 hours, and services such as farm visits are all things that add extra value for the school. As we talked about last week, schools are always trying to increase student acceptance of fruits and vegetables. So putting a sign on the carrot saying what farm they came from might make the students more likely to take those carrots, increasing the value of the product. Fresher product likely means higher quality product. So again, you can increase student consumption of the food with a higher quality product. And it also could reduce the amount of product that the chefs have to throw away because of spoilage. So that's very clearly adding value to the product. Farm visits may add to an academic component that the school is looking for. And again, those may increase the likelihood that the students will eat fruits and vegetables. So those are all things, extra specifications that the school could add where they could reasonably make the decision that it's worth it to pay a little bit more for products with these qualities. And these are also things that are easier for a local producer to do. And you might even be doing them already and just not getting extra credit for them. But they are theoretically possible for a big distributor or a producer from across the country to do as well if they really wanted that school's business. But it's likely going to add significantly to their price, making the local producer a more cost-effective option.
So we have another question. How do you determine if a school have a yearly procurement method or a monthly, weekly method?
And that's up to each school, and you want to just ask them directly. You know, if it's a school that you've been doing business with in the past, you can just have that conversation about how they're planning to do their purchasing in the coming year. Or if it's a school that, you know, you want to do business with in the future, and we did have a list on last week's webinar of how you can find contact information for schools around the state. If you're reaching out to them and saying, hey, wanted to let you know that I am a lettuce vendor or a popcorn vendor or whatever it is, and I'm interested in selling to your school, wanted to make sure you had information about my products. During that conversation, you could ask them about what kind of purchasing they do.
The resources that Rosie was referring to are located on the Vermont Farm to School Network website.
The last thing on this slide is a mention of geographic preference, and we're going to talk about this more later, but very basically for unprocessed or minimally processed agricultural items, USDA regulations do allow a school to give a geographic preference to vendors who meet the school's definition of local. And we're going to talk more about this again later, but basically for this type of product, the school is allowed to say outright, we are willing to pay X% more for this product if it meets our definition of local. But again, all of these methods do allow that non-local vendor to compete. They just make it more likely that the local vendor is going to be the one who's responsive and at the lowest price.
And we'll get into more geographic preference later in the slides.
Yes. So this, very sadly, is what schools can't do. And this is what we've been doing in Vermont for years and why we have a really wonderful, outstanding farm-to-school program in many schools in Vermont. So a school cannot include local or Vermont-grown or grown within 100 miles of my school as a product specification. If the school did that, then the vendor from across the country has no way of competing. So it's not just about the local guy being more competitive anymore. It becomes about the local guy being the only one who gets a chance to compete at all. And unlike product freshness or farm field trips or farmer origin labeling, the federal regulations find that local by itself isn't a specification that adds value to the product. And this is a really kind of a hard thing for us who like eating local food and like to encourage local food in our schools to be telling you, but unfortunately that's what the regulations are. And when we remember that these are federal taxpayer dollars that are paid by people all over the country, you can understand a little bit why we're not allowed to say that they can only be spent on products grown in a certain part of the country or on distributors based in a certain part of the country. These are, you know, taxpayer dollars coming from all over the place, and so we can't say, no, you can only spend them in this one place. So again, obviously this is not how we've been doing farm to school in Vermont, so it's going to require a change in how we think about it. In the past, we've been using local as shorthand for all those great qualities that go along with it, and so now schools have to just start defining what those qualities are. And you as a local producer or processor can help them do that.
And just so you know, Rosie and I have been doing workshops for food service, and will continue to do workshops for farmers in person if required or asked for. But we are developing templates to help food service directors articulate those qualities that they're trying to get with the local products. So please do contact us if you need some help around that.
And we just got a question, does it apply only to public schools? Do private schools that are funded through tuition have more freedom in wording? So basically any school, public or private, can choose to participate in the National School Lunch Program. So we have many private schools in Vermont that participate in the National School Lunch Program. And if they do that, they get a little bit of federal reimbursement for all the eligible meals that they serve to students. And so when they take that federal funding, then these regulations apply. So we also have some private schools in Vermont that choose not to participate in the National School Lunch Program, and those schools certainly don't need to follow these regulations. But you would be surprised, there are quite a few private schools that do participate in the program, and therefore they need to follow these regulations.
So I was speaking about helping and creating templates to help school food directors and managers, and here's an example of one. As a producer, you will not see this template. It's developed for schools. However, it's an attempt to help schools and school nutrition directors and managers to articulate their values and criteria for buying local products. Here are some ways that schools can articulate their farm-to-school program to help producers learn what they're looking for beyond specific products. So it could be importance of connecting to local farms and agriculture, providing health and nutrition educational opportunities. They can put in their farm-to-school statement that they're supporting local and regional producers. That's not saying that it has to be a local product. It's saying this is our belief. They can have in their farm-to-school statement that they're exposing students to fresh and minimally processed products. They can even talk about how they define local and regional foods and that they prefer them, but they cannot require them. They can also develop a tier system and say that they have a tier 1 or a tier 2, just to describe how they are marketing their products. So that gives farmers and producers an understanding of what are the criteria outside of the actual object, the actual food that the schools are trying to achieve qualities of. So these are some additional specifications for products you might see when you see these solicitations. And the idea is that we're trying to get schools to be as specific as possible. So back to the, are they going for the whole year? And so you're sending them a price and responding to the criteria for a whole year. So that volume is different, and so your price point might be different. Or are they really looking for seasonal products? Are they looking for products for a special local food event? They can, with an informal bid, just call 3 people on the phone or look on a website and record the prices of products. So it doesn't have to be an incredibly formal process. And with informal bids, they get to choose who they call. So they could want to do harvest of the month, and they could set it up seasonally, or they could set it up for the entire year. They could also want to get a solicitation for their fresh fruit and vegetable program or for a summer meals program. It's really up to the school to decide how they're going to divide up their bids. And then there's the specifications for products. So for instance, the Green Mountain Harvest lettuce is hydroponic. And so Thatcherbrook Primary School could have said, we're looking for hydroponically grown lettuce, certain pack size, certain ripeness, Could also be quality of the harvest. It can be grade, pack size, that's pretty typical. And availability, as Rosie said, harvested within 24 hours of delivery. And getting this specific may seem very cumbersome, but in fact, these are the unspoken characteristics that people are using to buy local. And so they have this in their mind that there's going to be these certain characteristics of the food they buy. And by being more specific and transparent about it, it actually, in my mind, is a benefit to the farmers so that you know exactly what product you're growing and you don't show up with really ripe tomatoes when they really meant to put them on a slicer, and really ripe tomatoes don't love slicers. So this is just the specifications. Again, will seem cumbersome, but in the end we really feel will help the farmer. So there are vendor requirements. So a school, depending on how deep they want to go, they can definitely ask this list of things. What kind of customer service? Do you have a history of good customer service? How's the communication going to be set up? Your safety plans, time and place of delivery, and will the products be source identified? And when communicating with a school, it's really to your advantage as a producer to point out the services that you provide, even if the food service doesn't ask. Now, if they are basing their bid decisions on some qualities that you have mentioned that they did not mention to the other folks bidding, they will have to go out and bid again. But it doesn't hurt, as we're all learning through this process, to point out what it is about you, what it is about your service that is special to that school, to that person. It's also a chance to find out some of the specifications that could make or break a solicitation or a purchasing agreement. And the other thing is there will be solicitations that maybe you can meet 90% of those requirements, and it's okay to be honest and transparent and say, I can't do that last thing of coming once a month for taste tests. That's fair, because you will be compared to other people who maybe also cannot come once a month. So it's important to be very clear and to respond specifically to the requirements that the director is putting forward. And you just thought you were finished, but we're not. So again, here are the examples and attributes that benefit local producers and make you stand out from others. It's important you make sure your school customers understand what you provide in addition to your food. They may forget that you actually always come in at harvest for the harvest dinner, that you always come in during Ag Literacy Week and read books to the kids. Also, if you're as I said, if you're unable to meet certain requirements, acknowledge it, be transparent. You may not be the only one who is unable to meet the requirements. So what happens next is that the manager decides, awards the contract, and they have the right to award multiple bids to multiple producers. It's important that they mention this in the solicitation. And as a producer, say it's a market basket of possibly 10 crops, it's okay not to bid on every single crop. You can bid on the crops that you know you can produce well and for that school in particular. And then, as I said, the school reserves the right to rebid if they aren't satisfied with the bids that came in, or they are concerned about getting competitive pricing.
And the schools don't have to include these, but if they do, this is what those things mean. They might include that in their solicitation.
Right. And again, it might be as simple as a phone call because they know you and your products. But what we're trying to do is just help people be more transparent and clear about what they're really expecting from vendors. And then there's managing the contract. So the work's not over for the director or manager, and it's not over for you, because along with winning the bid, you also are, as Rosie had said, required to be responsive and responsible, doing what you said you would do, when you said you would do it, and having adequate communication and doing what you agreed on.
So we didn't spend a ton of time on this earlier, but we spend a lot of time on it when we teach schools about proper procurement. And that is that they need to go with the lowest price vendor who is both responsive and responsible. So responsive means that you as the vendor, you have responded to what their specifications were. So if they said the product needs to be harvested within 48 hours of delivery, you responded and said, yes, I can do that. If you responded and said, no, my product is going to be a week old, then they wouldn't have to consider your price even if it was the lowest price. So that's responsive. That's one thing that they're looking for. And then responsible is, again, that follow-up, making sure that you're actually capable of doing it. So, this is where if a school checks your references, checks with other schools that have done business with you, and they find that in the past you've always promised that you could get all this stuff to them, but then you were late or the product quality was bad or whatever it is, the school doesn't have to go with a vendor who they find is not responsible. And that also applies to the school's past experience with a vendor. So if you told the school, yeah, I can do all this, and then you didn't, they are able to take that into account in the future when doing business with you.
And to cancel the contract.
Right. So don't overpromise. So I talked a little bit earlier about geographic preference as a specification. And so schools are allowed, the school is allowed to apply a geographic preference when they're purchasing some unprocessed or minimally processed agricultural products. And this is an exception to the general principles of procurement that was made in the 2008 Farm Bill, and the Vermont Congressional Delegation actually had a lot to do with it. So essentially, if a school wants to, they can say ahead of time to all the bidders that they will give a certain % price preference to vendors that can meet their definition of local. And the school gets to define that. So if the school says our definition of local is within 100 miles of the school, or within the state, or within the region, the school defines what that definition of local is that they'll give the price preference for. And this doesn't mean that they won't consider a product that doesn't meet those specifications, but it means that they're willing to pay a certain % more for a product that does. So a school may say that they will give a 20% price preference for apples that are grown within Vermont, if that's their definition of local. And then if the Vermont apples are 15% more than the Washington apples, when they go out to bid and check those prices, then they can still purchase the Vermont apples even though they weren't the lowest price. But if the Vermont apples were 21% more than the Washington apples, they have to go with the Washington apples because they said that they would only pay 20% more for those Vermont apples. So this makes the school decide up front how much that local definition is worth to them. They can't go back after the bids have come in and decide that they actually are willing to pay 21% more. So if the school is going to apply a geographic preference, they have to tell you when they ask you for the price or when they go out to bid. So you don't really need to worry about this from your perspective, other than, of course, you could encourage them to do it. But just know that if you see that language in there that says we're going to give a 20% geographic preference for items that are sourced within 100 miles of our school or grown within Vermont, that's what that means. That means that they're willing to give you a little bit of a price preference. And this is what so geographic preference can be used for unprocessed or minimally processed agricultural products. So, a potato right out of the ground that has still got dirt on it, they can use geographic preference for that. But they can also use geographic preference for products that have been cooled, refrigerated, or frozen, peeled, sliced, diced, cut, chopped, shucked, or ground. So, lots of processing of vegetables and also processing of things like flour. Making patties without additional ingredients added. So, for example, if you're making your ground beef into hamburger patties, a school could use Geographic Preference for that. If you were making your ground beef into hamburger patties that had additional flavorings or spices or fillers, then that would be considered a fully processed product and you couldn't use Geographic Preference. Drying and dehydrating are allowed. Washing, packing, bagging, vacuum packing, that's allowed. Any oxidization prevention, such as adding a little lemon juice to apple slices to prevent them from browning, that's fine. Butchering livestock and poultry is fine, as well as pasteurizing milk, or pasteurizing eggs as well. So all of these are things that don't really alter the nature of the product, and so schools are allowed to use Geographic Preference when purchasing products that have had these procedures done to them. And again, completely unprocessed products can be purchased using this method as well.
Okay, forward contracts. I've used this phrase, either forward contracts or contract growing with farmers and food service to set up a system which is an alternative to CSA, a community share agriculture, because CSAs generally can't be done in a way that meets procurement regulations for schools. So what's the benefit for the school? Being able to line up products ahead of time and plan menus in advance. And the benefit to the farmer, a guaranteed buyer at a competitive price. Before entering into the forward contract, be sure you understand the risks, both to the district and to you, the supplier. We have the next slide that talks more about forward contracts to keep rolling.
And I do want to highlight what Abby just said. Some schools in Vermont have been using CSAs in the past, and we tried to figure out how that could work under the federal procurement regulations, and it really can't, because a CSA, under a CSA model, the school is saying, yeah, we'll support your farm no matter what. And because you're using federal taxpayer money, you really can't do that. It's kind of it would be a special benefit to one farm and not another farm if you did that. But forward contracts are a way of being able to still plan ahead and count on getting certain products from a certain farm.
Right, and this can be done through a formal or informal bid. And also, if there's a crop failure, there will be language in that contract that has a contingency plan. So it could be that the contract's for salad greens every week, and there's a crop failure on the salad greens, but can be replaced with a similar product, which might be head lettuce. Those are the kinds of things that have to be specified in the contract.
And this is something that a school might do, say, in January or February, and say, next year we are looking to purchase this many pounds, 40 pounds of acorn squash a week for September through December, and they would go out to bid in January, and you would be supplying your prices based on product that you haven't even yet planted. So that's very basically how that would work.
Mm-hmm. Next. So make sure that the forward contract is as specific as necessary for you to grow exactly what the school wants. That would include variety, size, harvest and delivery time. Those are all important specifications in a contract. As I said, a crop failure would not necessarily cause a farmer to be not responsible. It's just because it ended up, but that you were unable to fulfill the contract, and that is a basic understanding in a forward contract deal. So just make sure when you are seeing these solicitations that you check on what the responsibility is when there is a crop failure.
And that could be as simple as releasing the farmer from responsibility, mm-hmm. or saying that the farmer has to supply a like product. So you would then have to turn around and go down the road and buy the onions from or butternut squash from your neighbor to supply the school.
Right.
So we've gone over what the basic procurement regulations are for schools. There is a lot more to them, but you don't need to worry about all the documentation and other regulations that go along with procurement. That's up to the poor food service manager. And we've also talked a bunch about the qualities of your products that might make them more desirable and therefore more competitive in a school's procurement process. And then last week we talked about the actual products that schools are serving and what the products they want to purchase may look like in terms of sizes and varieties, labeling, and food safety. So at this point we're going to open it up for any questions that you have about anything we've covered in these two presentations. If you'd like to ask a question over the air, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we will unmute you. Or you can go ahead and type in a question, in which case we'll just read your question off and read it aloud. So go ahead and feel free to ask any questions that you've got or raise your hand if you want us to unmute you. And I'm not seeing any come in. So I hope, this is a kind of a complex, it's a lot to throw at you, but I hope it helps you understand a little bit more about what's going on from the food service manager side of things.
Reference.
Let's see. So if we don't have any questions now, I'm going to move on to this one last slide. It's a little bit of a bonus. These are other marketing opportunities for producers that didn't really fit in well in other parts of our presentation. So most of you are probably already aware of the Harvest of the Month campaign and their resources. And many Vermont schools are using Harvest of the Month to increase student excitement about certain fruits or vegetables, for signage in the cafeteria, and they do buy more of the highlighted items during the month that they're highlighted. So if you're a producer of one of the Harvest of the Month items, you're going to want to know about that, and it may be something that you want to advertise to the schools that you work with. Let's see. And if you are a larger producer and can supply at least one full tractor trailer truckload of a single USDA foods product, and those are, we talked a bit about that last week, those are the additional in-kind contributions that the federal government makes towards the school meals program. So it's actually food that the federal government buys. So if you're large enough to supply at least a full tractor trailer truckload of a product, you could potentially supply that program, in which case the federal government will be purchasing your product. It's too large a scale for most of our producers, but if it's something you're interested in, please do reach out to me. I handle that. This is Rosie, and I'd be happy to tell you more about it, and my contact information is going to be on the next slide. And if you're a processor, you might be interested in processing some of those USDA Foods products for schools. So for example, that might be turning USDA Foods cheese into pizzas, like with Possibilities, which we saw at the beginning of this slide, or the presentation. And again, if you want more information on what the raw products are for that or how to get started with this, you can reach out to me directly and I'll help you get started.
We have questions.
We have questions. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to skip that.
Okay.
When a school decides to place a geographic preference on an item, does this need to be approved by anyone else? And as long as the school is following the regulations, they're only applying the geographic preference for those types of items that we talked about earlier, then no, they don't need to have it approved by anybody. The school does need to make sure that everybody knows about it so that when they're going out to bid, they're making it very clear to potential vendors that they're going to apply this geographic preference and what it is. But there's, no, they don't have to run that through the state or the feds or anybody else. So we're getting a question, there are so many schools and districts, is there a catalog or site that groups all proposals from all schools? It seems like keeping track of all possible requests for proposals from all schools will be very time consuming. That's certainly true. You will be happy to know that a lot of the schools in Vermont buy through the Food Directors Association, which is a buying club. And so they actually do procurement as a group on behalf of all the schools in their group. And I didn't include the slide with their contact information in this presentation, but it was in last week's presentation. So Bob Clifford and Doug Davis are the two food service directors that manage that buying club. And so that would just be one solicitation that would come out from them for a whole bunch of schools rather than one. Some schools are purchasing as a supervisory union, so you may want to reach out to your local supervisory unions, and you may be able to just kind of get those requests for proposals that way. If this is a formal method, they're going to need to be posting it on their school websites, in the local newspaper. I don't think that we have a clearinghouse for those, but that would be one place to look. And then food service management companies generally do all their purchasing as a big company. So if you, food service management companies operate the school meals programs for a number of schools in Vermont, so you can reach out directly to those food service management companies. Again, those were listed on that slide in last week's webinar.
Okay, we have another question. Are food service directors and staff required to take a procurement workshop or class? If not, how do we expect them to know all about this? So there's been trainings last August. There's been 10 regional trainings around the state. There's additional trainings coming up. There'll be more trainings in August and as part of
USDA requiring that the state agencies start enforcing this, starting next year, we as the Agency of Education, when we go out and do reviews of the school meals programs to make sure they're serving everything that they should be serving, we also have to start reviewing them to make sure that they're doing proper procurement. And so during that process, especially in the first couple of years, we're mostly just going to be providing a lot of technical assistance and making sure that they know what the regulations are and that they're doing things properly. So it's going to be, it's a lot to learn, and there's a lot more to it than what we've covered today for the food service manager. So, you know, now that you know this stuff, you can be a help to your customers. You can always send people to me if they're confused, but we are providing a lot of resources as a state. And when we start reviewing that, it effectively becomes a requirement that they get some form of training in it so that they can start following the regulations.
If they're great learners by webinar and reading, they can learn it that way. I mean, it isn't required that they get training as long as they learn it.
It's required that they do it. So we're providing a lot of different ways for them to learn how to do it.
Right. And there is, I know that there are small purchases being made by a lot of schools in their ultra-local circle. And so when it comes to, is there a one place that's all listed? No. So the best thing is to start with the existing accounts and helping, finding out when they're going to be soliciting and what's going to be in the solicitation. And the other thing is that these regulations apply to school meal programs purchasing products and services with federal funds. So if the parent-teacher organization or farm-to-school committee at a school wants to do an event featuring local foods and they raise the money for this event themselves, they don't need to go through the procurement process. So that money never goes into the school nutrition program account. And because it's separate, it doesn't fall under these federal regulations.
Okay, last chance for questions. I'm going to put up the slide with our contact information. So this is how to reach out to us if you had a question that you came up with at the last minute or didn't think was relevant to other folks, or if you think of a question later, definitely feel free to reach out. This process is going to be a bit of a change from how we've been doing things in Vermont in the past. And so Abby and I are here to help everybody, producers and processors and vendors, as well as the schools, get through this process. And with that, since I'm not seeing any more questions, I think that we will go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you all so much for listening. Again, we are going to put these webinars on the Vermont Feed website. So if you wanted to go back and watch them again, or if you wanted to share them with someone else, they should be posted there fairly soon. And we'll also post a couple of the resources that we referred to in last week's presentation, including that list of school contacts and some additional resources. We'll post those there as well. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining, and have a great day.